Hi, Nick Tockert here with the Historical Fencing Guild. Well, folks, we're on to video 3 of my Supernatural Defense series. And in the last two, we discussed vampires and we discussed werewolves. Now we're starting to get into something a little more delicate, that being the Fae. The Fae is a blanket term for a series of interwoven otherworldly entities, usually with an elemental connection, very elaborate, usually immortal and or ageless. Though primarily recognized under Celtic traditions, the Fae can be found in one form or another in every single major culture. They are often considered a precursor species, usually with ties with the wild places. Many times they are the smaller people who live in the rocks, which runs an interesting parallel with the real-world discovery of a type of hominid that was roughly 3 feet tall, found in caves. And I do have a theory when we get to Fae that is very different than my normal theories on lycanthropy or vampirism, because a Fae, one does not become a Fae. One either is or is not. And Fae function and arc overlapping with things like spirits and demonic entities. So they get very, very hard to tack down. It's both something we intrinsically know and can't really define easily. But I do want to separate Fae propaganda from Fae folklore. What do I mean? When I say Fae, two sets of entities pop up in most people's popular culture influenced minds. That being your elves, and that being your fairies. Because the fairy can apply, the term can apply to the people, it can apply to their courts, it can apply to individuals, it can apply to species. So, let's break a couple things down. There are several courts of Fae. They are usually organized in a feudal hierarchy, with some courts ruling over others or interrelated, depending on what legends and what you count as Fae. Now, if you are thinking of Fae as wish-granting pretty pixies, you are in for a real weird, bad awakening. The Fae are overlapping again with nature spirits, so we get this, are they tangible, aren't they? And where are they? Well, as I said, every culture has gotten into them, and I do have a theory where the more tangible Fae may have gone. You see, humanity, being Homo sapien, has this wonderful ability and tendency. We both pack bond with nearly anything. One of the most modern and, I think, delightful examples of this pack bonding is with Roombas. Small mechanical device. People, if it breaks, they send it in. They want their specific Roomba back because it's essentially a mechanical pet. We also tend to be a rather lascivious species and will boff and or have intercourse with any number of things. So I'll get back into that once we track. Now, subsets of Fae. You have your Seelie elves, your fairies, your brownies, basically considered the lower ranks of Fae. Bogarts, brownies and bogarts, possibly being related to some legends. Dwarves. Interestingly enough, the dwarven people overlap in the machinations of the Fae. Leprechauns, other forms of house Fae, kobolds, are actually, contrary to D&D's now lizard folk dragon worshippers, kobolds or tended to be either mining or home fae. They operated, and if displeased, would sour milk and cause mischief. If pleased, might accomplish little tasks. The higher up you go, the hierarchy, from the little tiny peoples with lots and lots of names, usually under the elf kind of clause, all the way up to the Seelie and Unseelie elves, being the courts of light and darkness, or summer and winter. These courts have ties in with the seasons. They are believed to influence the change of the seasons, which in a world where climate change is a real thing, bodes interesting questions. When you are thinking of the Fae conceptually, again, do not think of Tinkerbell. And do not think of Legolas either, although the archetypical young Fae Lord out on an adventure, out looking for merriment and entertainment, is an archetype of Fae you're far more likely historically to encounter than some of the more terrifying other aspects, such as the Wild Hunt, which again overlaps the Fae, it overlaps demonic. It's in that place where paganism and Judeo-Christian beliefs kind of start to merge, and the folklore of entities changes, and they may be rebranded, they may be re-identified. It's very interesting. But it's important. Do not think of Fae as wish-granting things. Do not think of them as simply the fair folks. So, we hear the Fae. We remember the fair folk. What people forget is they grab their iron crucifix and spit to try to ward off the evil. They are not to be trifled with. At best, any given variant of the Fae may function like a metaphysical mafia. That's why you find many, many traditions of placation, very strict rules of conduct, because the mentality of the Fae is radically different than ours. The higher up you get in the concept of Fae, the more advanced your Seelie elves, things like that, the more Lovecraftian the undertones. These are immortal, undying, timeless entities who have both a perspective and a set of interests and rules far beyond human scope. Long and short is you don't mess with the Fae. Despite being very popular, often it's hard to find resources on the Fae because they actively encourage, through the folklore, folks not to talk about them. So I admit to being mildly dubious, superstitiously, about this very video, on the caveat that I'm in a less active location, and, folks, I'm doing this video with respect to prevent idiocy wherever possible, and at worst it makes things a little more challenging, so here's hoping. Among the rules of the Fae, should you encounter any of them, be polite, but do not thank them nor ask anything of them. They take debt deadly serious. Now, granted, they will say, don't thank me. At the same time, where if through hook, crook, usually in honest intent, because they can tell, you do a favor for a Fae, they may reward you richly, or they may stalk and destroy your world forever. The level of fickle and broad strokes that the Fae represent. So, how do we, from a supernatural defense category and from folklore loose study category, break this down into easy to understand terms? As is my tradition, I'm going to try to avoid hard to pronounce non-English words, and keep it in terms that you may, even if the term is vaguely inaccurate, the description is much more easy for our fragile human minds to understand. So, what kind of fae are you going to see? Well, fae may manifest in the form of nature spirits. These are things like dryads. These could be any number of very dangerous creatures like kelpie, selkies, shape-shifting things that basically lure men to their doom. There's a whole genre. I could do a whole video on things that lure men to their doom, but most of it is don't try to have intimate relations with anyone you're not supposed to, and stick to your own species, and most of the time you'll be fine. Now, getting into the subtypes and how to deal with them. As I said, one of the most common forms encountered often at crossroads, at certain times of night, you'll find this, are the bored elven lords who may issue a challenge, to a race or a duel where the winner is, if you win, you're rewarded. If you lose, you are pulled under for servitude, and you're not given much of a chance. The best chance is to be polite and just do your best. Now, that is one of the more subtle, many times glowing fae, which overlap with spirits. You see will-o-wisps, and that overlaps with the natural effect of foxfire that moves through the woods of certain bogs. I have seen glowing green flames making their way through boggy forests that would lead the unwary elsewhere. As a natural event, more likely than a supernatural. But this overlaps because, remember, much of magical study, much of folklore was people trying to understand things without the scientific system of breaking it down and testing it. So it's an interesting process. That being said, this is one of the few places where knowing how to fence properly might not be a bad idea. Very rarely will a fae in a challenge actually kill the person, and there's some debate how long they're kept underhill, which is essentially in a pocket dimension of their will. But when you're immortal and you can inflict immortality on someone, the types of punishment, for example, can be unthinkable. The phrase fate worse than death. If it seems like I'm taking it seriously, perhaps more than the werewolf and more than the vampire, is both the werewolf and vampire most of the time just want to kill you. The fae get very complex. Again, think Lovecraftian. Think Faustian deals here. Always be polite. That means if. And it's interesting. You would never open your home or your campfire to a vampire. But to a fae, you'd better show every form of hospitality. With the exception of direct requests, direct thank you. You don't want to say thank you to a fae. One, it's offensive. Two, you may just owe them. The wrong kind of fae will take that debt and hold on to it. Again, think of the fae as the mob. Okay? Old school mob, not new gangbangers. They take over an area, they pacify the area for most of it outside of their interests, and if you play by the rules, they leave you alone, you leave them alone. But if you get involved, you may end up swimming with the fishes, as the saying goes. So, combating the fae, we're going to get into it. It's like, much of it is much more a mental action. It's how are you going to, if it's a sentient, like high fae, how are you going to deal with it? That a lot of it breaks down to simple offerings of honey, out the door at certain nights. Again, giving them their space. If you suspect fae are operating, especially like a house fae who's working on things, if you thank them, they take it as you're asserting dominance. They'll stop and curse everything. You kind of have to just understand Fae are a natural force that can be offended. So you wouldn't go out and most people, at least nowadays, don't go out and thank the sun for shining, and they certainly don't go out and shake their fist at like a tornado because we understand scientifically it does little good. Where Fae get involved is if you shake a fist, that tornado might just pull a 180 and further ruin your day. Of the primary courts, Seelie and Unseelie, Unseelie tend to have more object monsters, things like the Sluaw. The Goblin courts get more in there. And these are things that will kill you and terrify you. Seelie tend to have more radiant shining. And this is one of those real things where you have to understand good and evil and light and dark are two different axes. Okay? On the good evil, if you're encountering an angelic entity and you're being good and you're following the rules, you don't have anything to worry about usually. That's why they open up with the classic be not afraid. With something demonic, it's going to mess you up as much as it can. And if it's being civil, it's so it can mess you up later. That's kind of how they operate. The Fae are they're literally a different, this isn't a straight line, this is an axis, and it gets really weird really fast. As I said, certain Fae have ties more to elements, and certain elemental considered entities overlap with the Fae courts. It gets real blurry in the realm of folklore. This is where you can find Tommy knockers. They may be ghosts, they may be Fae, they may be gnome-like creatures. They may be the ghosts of gnome-like creatures. It gets thick. The trick is if avoidance. If you encounter one, be polite, promise nothing, ask nothing, never lie to a Fae. The Fae will lie to you. Well, they won't. They'll be honest, but it will be so twisted by the time it's done that it would have been easier if they lied to you. The Fae won't lie to you. I want to correct that so that there's no misunderstanding. Now we get into, but how do I combat the Fae? Okay, a lot of it depends. For example, leprechauns. There's whole catch the leprechaun, get the gold. Yeah, but there are rules and regulations for how you get that gold, what wish is granted, things like that. The gold isn't worth it, folks. They could put the come hither on you, pull you under hill, and you're never seen again, or you pop up 100 years later with no memory of what happened, and no one's real sure what happened. Or 20 years and your wife and kids have all aged or died. It gets shady. Combatively, though, they can be combated. Depending on the Fae, is how your smaller, more primal Fae. Things like goblins, to things like redcaps, which are much larger, but on the mojo scale are different. These elemental vile things. Some people believe Pudwudgies the North American mini guys who run around and cause trouble, may be similar. Some gremlin legends overlap. None of them like cold iron. They don't like metal, especially cold iron. Dwarves seem to be a subset that it's different, but they're part of a branch with brownies, where metal, even leprechauns obviously, can function more around metal than elves. I think it has to do with the amount that metal disrupts certain kinds of magics and beings of magic energy, which could be just simply extra dimensional. It gets it complicated. The mind is the greatest opponent thing, because you don't want to go toe-to-toe with Fae. Because you're looking at something that's essentially equivalent of a caster. It can curse the heck out of you, and it's difficult to deal with. Salt can come useful, especially in the spiritual overlap. Cold iron is your friend. Wrought iron is your friend. If you think you're bewildered, oftentimes it's an airy effect in the forest. Taking off and turning your clothing allegedly breaks this. Um, some people who have concerns never go anywhere without a piece of metal on their body, usually in contact. Um, Cold iron again working best. Cold iron being anathema to the Fae, so any metal weapon is more effective than a non-metal weapon. And the closer you are to iron, where actually steel, while stronger, is less effective. You really want that wrought iron, that cold iron, that black iron, blood of the earth kind of stuff to deal with these guys. Now, that means it's treated like an allergy. So things like iron filings could be a very devastating response. Any melee weapon, iron. Again, a shotgun slug that's a chunk of like rebar, this is gonna mess up and end up, give a Fae a very bad day. Just understanding that if you're killing something that's a functionally immortal, ageless, it will likely have friends, family, and uh, attachments that will come knocking on your door. You're really risking a metaphysical gang war. And I know I keep coming to that metaphor, but this is how they operate. Respect, avoidance, neutralization. And then acceptance, because if you do it there, you're going to have problems. Your crops will. But if it ends up right, your crops may bloom. They're an interesting lot. The lesser phase, your goblins, your angry bitey things. These are best. They are much like when we get into spirits and other things, because this is where that field overlaps. Environmental. They tend to come out when it's too cluttered, too dark, too dirty. The resonance of a place attracts that level of darkness and empowers it. Again, according to folklore. So one can fight that, and we'll get into this. This material will be repeated throughout the course. By simply cleaning, maintaining. Now, it is interesting. For example, the Pudwudgie can cause a lot of trouble, but they are very, very prone to native strawberries. So, again, tactically, when you're combating things, you have to go, what will neutralize? And I talk about this in my practical defense. When I say, how do you avoid being mugged? Well, don't be like, was it John and Martha Wayne? I can't remember Bruce Wayne's dad's name offhand. But, if you have the option of a light shining path and Crime Alley, don't go down Crime Alley. Dealing with the Fae is a very similar form of wilderness tactical awareness. They have techniques that overlap with things like skinwalkers, especially if they're looking to cause trouble. Mimicry has been attributed to them very much. So you'll hear your voice. You'll hear someone else's. You'll hear your own voice calling you from the dark. Lights that guide people. I grew up near swamp. Near a bog, actually. Very, in some of the places in the woods, it was rather hazardous. Not terribly where I live, but nearby, absolutely. And the creatures like these guys will take delight in leading folks out there. So much of it is being very aware. You don't... Guys, we all have that internal, hey, maybe we shouldn't be out here at night. And then, like idiots, we challenge ourselves, and 9 times out of 10... or 99 out of 100, nothing happens. But we're in the discussion of what happens during that 100. That 99th percentile, that one bad day. You just don't want to mess with them. That being said, once you get to the more physical Fae, Grounding elements like the properties of cold iron, salt to an extent. Many have responded much like demonic entities and are repelled by faith, whether that's a form of spell casting in which the prayer is channeling divine energy or it has something to do with their own proclivities. I'm not real sure. But faith and a stout axe has never, been a bad idea. But you don't mess with them, okay? They usually tend to be protective of their own natural areas. So, going back to the Puddawudgie, if you have wild strawberries, you don't necessarily want to take them out. If you find you've taken out wild strawberries and things are going missing, there's unexplained damage, your crops aren't doing well, planting some strawberries way out on the far end of your property and leaving them the heck alone may just cause that all to stop. And that's not casting. That's more like, if you wad up a brown paper bags and you make a fake wasp's nest and you hang it up, it will often repel other wasps because they will see that and go, oh, this is somebody else's territory. Rules. You want to attract bees to pollinate your garden, you plant marigolds. You want to keep Puddawudgies out of the way, you put strawberries way off on your property and you leave them alone. Puddawudgies tend to get very shadow stuffy, though. And they're part of that Fey branch that gets difficult to find tangible. It's a very complicated area. And as we approach Halloween, of course, this is not the time to mess with things because they are very much in between. They're not, they're not good. They're not evil. They're not living, and they're not dead. They simply are. And if you're going to try to defend against them, you have to understand you're dealing with something that's likely ageless, immortal, and thinking in channels and parallels you can never imagine. So you have to respect that as an entity. Learn the rules and follow them. That is how you tactically respond. I don't want to say deal with. Tactically respond with the Fae. If you deal with the sentient conjured one, politely excuse yourself. Well, you have to be careful. But, I'd get out as fast as possible and hope it doesn't go too badly. I know this one sounds a little different. This sounds less tangible, but they tend to be inscrutable and observant. So dealing with them, if you have to fight any of the given Fae, you're going to go for cold iron. It's one of humans' things. It's why we drove them out. You look at the Fae attacks on the train lines, especially in Great Britain. There were stories of mounted radiant riders attacking because, the Fae don't like heavy metal. And why is that interesting? Well, as we've converted to plastics, we're getting farther and farther away from the heavy metals. And we're in an environment where we've done damage. Humanity has started a new era, the Anthropocene. That might come out to bite us in ways we never expected. So you need to be cautious. I mentioned the courts and I got distracted. I mentioned the terrors of the Seelie Court. The Seelie Court can cloud your mind where you can think that being eaten alive is a good thing. It's crazy. It's a sap of will. It's much more deception. As a caveat, I am going to discuss the wild hunt. The wild hunt may is the wild hunt is usually led by a huntsman of possibly Hearn. We get into the Green Man, which gets into some very rapidly into old pagan influences and things. But sometimes it's believed to be Satan, but Satan has been overlaid to any number of horned figures, especially the Green Man and satyrs, creatures of the wood. But the huntsman leads a pack of essentially hellhounds. Hellhounds being larger than normal black dogs, burning eyes that may or may not be iridescent. They move silently, they move fast. But they do follow rules of threshold. So, should you hear the call of a black dog, which is a resounding, deep, terrifying, to call it a bark is to call, it's like calling a Moab a firecracker. It does, an explosive. It doesn't define the extension of a grim, or which is a grim is usually a large black dog related to cemeteries and protecting the dead. Very powerful creature, but the hunt is usually populated by such things. And they are dispatched sometimes at random, but more often because somebody's done something wrong. They are very much spectral hitmen of the Fae, to my understanding and experience. This is, desecrating a fairy mound or attempting to, tinkering with the natural flow of energies, blighting places you really shouldn't, consorting with the wrong things in their backyard, attempting certain ritual sacrifices. If it goes wrong, instead of getting who you want, you just cheese off the local fae. And they will hunt relentlessly during the night, and if you see them, they will come for you until you cross your threshold. Thinking very much terms like the spirit of the Headless Horseman, which, famously stalked Ichabod Crane. Be it, a hoax of Bram Bones or something more spectral and supernatural, they function the same way. Complete with there are boundaries that have to be bypassed or prevented. Moving water being a profound one. And we'll get back into them, probably retread this a bit during the spirit section, because this is where the Fae heavily overlap the spirits. And certain dark spiritual entities are attributed to the Fae, possibly wrongly, possibly correctly. But that's where, again, environmental, religious protections, spiritual protections, whatever your system, mentality. It's best not to think on these things too long, lest it attract them. You'll hear that about things like skinwalkers. You'll hear that about things like fae, spirits. Really, you have to be careful even contemplating such. And it must be done with, again, respect and understanding, according to the folklore. Take it how you will. There are people who go out ghost hunting looking for trouble. And if you go in homes, you're more likely to encounter spirits, which we'll get into in the next video. But if you go out in the forested places, you may bump into other things. And the vast majority of these other natural force feeling, sentient, sometimes malevolent, sometimes benevolent. There are protective agencies that may look over forests and places. They exist. And if you are not careful, and they encounter them, they can kill you, they can take you away. Historically, they may switch your baby out with a changeling, which just dies shortly after. Although the changeling myth has ties to actually the onset and notice of certain types of autism, actually, and actually can have some very derogatory implications in that community, because to the parent, to the uneducated parent, what looks like a normal neurotypical child to a point develops strange behaviors. It has historically, been attributed to autism. Well, manners that we now would attribute to the autistic spectrum. It's fascinating. So we have to be very delicate and respectful when we get on those things. I keep harping on that word respect. Fae are almost as old as dragons, perhaps older, as supernatural entities and as folklore elements. Now, I mentioned earlier that I have a theory on the Fae separate to all the metaphysical, magical stuff, and the overlap that we're discussing for folklore purposes. The Fae, where did they go? Now, some say they were driven out, some say they died due to the metals, some say World Wars I and II, considering everything that was flying around, may have wiped large portions of them out sideways and empowered others by the, prodigious distribution of death. But I have a theory that I developed in college. It was Tucker's theory of elven inclusion. The theory is this. Like the Neanderthal, we didn't wipe them out entirely. We interbred with them. This is why, to this day, you can find people with Neanderthal. Now, I'm told that some say it's Neanderthal. I have trouble saying that, so I may bounce back and forth. That's not ignorance on my part. That's yet another accommodation for my stuttering and other vocal impairments. Please don't hold that against me. But, so the Fae may have bred in. Now, why is that interesting to someone like me? Well, there is a theory attached to that through mere observation, because it started originally when I went to school with a gentleman who had Neanderthal features. Produced brow, incredibly strong jaw, disproportionately long arms, incredibly muscular even at a young age. Facial hair, body hair, again, at a surprisingly young age. And at the point, I'm like, he looks like a caveman. And he looks like a Neanderthal. And then we find out years later that there is the DNA. And whenever you take DNA to an extent, you get a rattling of traits, And you have recessive traits, but you get the right blend, and recessive traits can pop up in odd places. Things like albinism, dwarfism. Throwbacks. Some people show more Neanderthal traits. Some people show physical, and in some circles believed to be psychic or spiritual traits, like the Fae. This is an interesting set of theory and a very slippery slope. But it is one I ponder from time to time, and you might find enjoyable. So, we may, through our population expanding and interbreeding, and, because as humanity travels far more than it ever did in a historical period, we intermix. It's wonderful. But it also might be just bringing back people with slightly more Fae tendencies, and that intrigues me. We're going to find a lot of intriguing things happening. when you start looking at folklore from the perspective of, instead of laughing at them for the lack of scientific limitation, look at it from a perspective. And this applies to all monsters. Okay? All historical monsters. One, even though they may not exist, their impact sociologically and psychologically on humanity is that they do. What that means is if people believe that every Sunday a giant lake monster is going to come out and eat them if they're on the lake, they may develop where Sunday is a day of rest. The seventh day is a day of rest, totally independent of any religious tendencies we have. And no one goes swimming. The source of it is a misidentifier, or maybe somebody saw a sturgeon breach, who knows. But they will respond to it as though it's real. And that is interesting. The power of belief is an interesting concept. And as writers and as people who are learning to manipulate our bodies and minds, understanding the effect, believing that we can make these changes, has, one moment, there we go, it overlaps. And that brings us back to the Fae, because anyone who has spent time in the woods for any length of time, a real length of time, you've camped, you've hiked, there are feelings and presences and effects. You'll get the sensation of being watched, or you'll hear things. And we try to attribute attributes to that, to assign attributes. And that's part of what makes the Fae so fascinating. Now that we have in-depth stories, some supposedly told by the Fae, some just elaborately made up. But at the end, there are very simple things. If you have to fight the Fae, you're going to use wrought iron. For the sword mastery types, again, swords, yay. Metal weapons, metal armor, metal helms, metal everything makes it less likely for them to touch you. It's poisonous to them. That's just weaponized logic. Modern sword masters and weapon masters, it gets more interesting. Because if you're writing and you're supporting the Fae, that very metallurgy can be a tremendous plot device. Ranging from things like maybe it's only ferrous metals, at which point aluminum is fine. So you get stories like Mercedes Lackey's Serrated Edge series involving making elf-safe race cars to modern stories like Deadfall, which is one of my own, that might feature adapting modern weaponry to be more Fae-friendly for their use. It's an incredible, complex. I barely skimmed the folklore because there's so many types. And that's not what this video series is about. It's, identify, basically is it a high Fae, low Fae? Low Faes are going to try to eat your face. This is your goblins, your red caps with their forever bleeding caps. Oh, God, the tusk guys. Who are the tusk guys? Some ogres. Trolls, for example, are considered part of Fae, although they operate, can be considered part of the Fae, in a different set of rules altogether, with the preferring to eat Christians, to being turned to stone by daylight, the whole living under bridges, Billy Goat's Gruff. It gets interesting. If you want more or more dedicated videos like this, let me know. If it seems like I'm being a little politic, I'm being a little politic. My experiences have led me to be cautious. And I'm okay with people laughing at me about that. They haven't seen what I've seen, so whatever. But, if you're out in the woods, and you hear a voice that isn't quite right calling you, best stick to your own business. And it doesn't hurt to keep, I don't know, a chunk of steel on you at all times. If only there were an easy way to do that. Folks, I hope you'd enjoyed this. This is, again, a divergence of what I normally do, but as it is October, and as my patrons have seemed to enjoy these flirting with folklore videos, I promise after I do the spirit video, I will do probably one more minimum, and we're going to really go, okay, bring this all together because there's a lot of crossover. The vampire legends bleed into lycanthropy, bleed into the fae, bleed into the more spiritual realm. How do we deal with it? So the next video will be one on your good friends, how to fight ghosts. And believe it or not, of the videos, it may be one of the most combative. And we will talk from there into how to, sort of for your freelance hunter, how to prep for it all, and tools, tricks, tactics of the trade, so to speak, that may be interesting or useful to you. So if you like this, obviously like, share, subscribe. This is a special thanks to the amazing Steve Agosto, my first patron. You've been with me since the beginning, and one of my oldest friends. I respect you, Steve. I hope you're enjoying these. The amazing and talented Cindy Kep, who is a wonderful author and just a talented lady, as well as dedicated to Steve Clausen, who has several business interests I will be referencing, and John Miner, who is the proprietor of Swackhammer Metals, which I'll be referencing in other things as his shop gets going. So I thank all the other people, the real live Heart and Blood Guild folks that I can't see because of COVID, and my family. If you enjoy these videos, obviously, if you're watching this through the Patreon secret link thing, thank you. If you're not, join up and you can see others like this as I put them out in thanks. Consider buying The Simple Sword. I am working on a sequel involving the axe, a sequel called The Strong Sword, and perhaps a more codified version of this very overarching subject matter, if there is interest. So your comments are crucial. So like this video, share it, preferably when it's out to the public, guys. Keep it under your hats for the patrons for a while. You guys have earned it. Be kind to each other. Be kind to yourself. Keep your guard up and your head on a swivel. And, as always, support your local swordmaster.